And now question 19, the last question on the KSP section. Last question on the KSP section said you had a saturated solution of aluminum phosphate. Aluminum phosphate goes into solution in this manner. So we'd have aluminum ions plus phosphate ions. We want it to shift to the right without adding any water. So in other words, we want this solid to turn aqueous. And we want more of the solid to go away. So we want this goes away. The solid needs to decrease. Note that we're not going to decrease the concentration of the solid because it's constant, but we are going to decrease the amount of the solid. So we need to pull out the aluminum with the phosphate. There are lots of possible things you could add. If you added hydroxide, for example, you would get aluminum hydroxide, which is a precipitate. So you'd see the aluminum combined with hydroxide, and you get aluminum hydroxide precipitate. Since that's a solid, it's going to drop out of the solution, and that's going to cause the equilibrium up above to shift to the right. The only thing is you can't add hydroxide by itself. You can't find hydroxide, so you need to put a cation with the hydroxide. So if you go to the storeroom to get something to add, you'd have to add, say, sodium hydroxide, or potassium hydroxide, or lithium hydroxide. However, you couldn't add something that is an insoluble hydroxide. For example, you couldn't use copper hydroxide because copper hydroxide is not soluble. And if copper hydroxide is not soluble, the hydroxides would not go into solution. They couldn't grab this aluminum. So the bottom line is you have to add something that is soluble that contains, I'll write this out in a little more detail. Add something soluble that contains an ion that will form a precipitate with either the lead, no, I'm sorry, either the aluminum or the phosphate. So another example, something else you could have added, I'll do it up the top. If I wanted to precipitate out the phosphate, I want to pull that out. Now we need something that would make an insoluble compound with the phosphate. So maybe I could add magnesium chloride. Magnesium chloride, we know, is soluble chloride. It's going to come apart into magnesium ions and chloride ions. And I'm just using these examples. There are literally hundreds of possibilities, maybe tens of possibilities, lots of possibilities. So the magnesium, this ion, could make a precipitate with the phosphate, and that would lower the phosphate. If you lower the phosphate, that goes down, this equilibrium shifts this way, so some of this has to decompose. Some of the aluminum phosphate has to decompose. So the bottom line, got to add something soluble that contains an ion that will form a precipitate with either the aluminum or the phosphate. The thing you add, though, has to be a compound, and it has to be a soluble compound. Otherwise, the ion is not free to attach to the aluminum or the phosphate.